What is it? You weren't supposed to come home today.
She did not scream. That was the part Caleb would never understand. The part that would hollow him out long after the lawyers stopped calling and the servers went dark. Not the rage, not the shattered crystal, not the name-calling or the tears or the desperate, ugly bargaining he had quietly rehearsed a response for on the elevator ride up. None of that came. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel like emptiness, the kind that feels like a decision already made. The penthouse sat 62 floors above the city, and from this height, the skyline looked exactly the way Caleb had always believed the world to be. Something beneath him. Floor-to-ceiling glass stretched along the northern wall like a monument to his own reflection, towers of steel and light burning cold and gold against a sky too dark for stars. He had chosen this building specifically because you could see everything from up here and nothing could see you back. He was already laughing when Jane walked in. She stopped in the doorway of the living room, and she did not move for a long time. She was still in her uniform, Army combat uniform, multicam pattern, her name, Jane, pressed in black block letters above the U.S. Army tape across her chest. She had come straight from a 6-hour classified briefing, the kind Caleb didn't have clearance to know existed. Her patrol cap was still on. Her posture was the kind of straight that isn't trained into a person so much as forged. She stood with one hand rising slowly to rest flat against her sternum, not clutching, not dramatic, just a quiet, almost clinical pressure, the way a field medic checks for a heartbeat before making the call. Her face was the part that would haunt him. Deep brown skin, lit from somewhere inside like something rare held up to a source of heat. Her eyes, large, dark, steady, were not wet with grief. They were wet with something older and far more dangerous. The exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying classified weight for years in silence and has finally made the calculation that the mission is over. Her brows drew together, not in anguish, in the quiet, precise concentration of a tactician identifying a target. Her lips pressed together once, trembled, stilled. Her chin lifted one measured degree. She had seen what she needed to see. Caleb stood in the center of the room in his navy suit, the one she had sent to the tailor, the one she had paid for with the bonus from the Meridian contract she had personally brokered. And beside him, pressed against his side with the ease of a woman no longer concerned about discovery, was the one in the red dress. Her arms looped around his chest like a signature on a claim form, her mouth curved at the corner, not toward Caleb, toward Jane, a performance, deliberate, calculated in its own smaller, crueler way. I am here, and you already know what this means. Caleb's jaw went tight. His eyes widened, his shoulders locked in the particular posture of a man who is not sorry, only caught. And there is a difference, a vast, unmistakable, irreversible difference between a man who is sorry and a man who is simply inconvenienced by being seen. He had told his business partners just 48 hours before this moment, voice rolling with a confidence too comfortable to be anything but rehearsed. She has nowhere else to go. She'd never leave. She's military. She doesn't know anything outside of this. He had believed it. That was perhaps the most expensive mistake of his life. Jane did not speak. She turned, footsteps soundless on the imported stone, and walked back down the hall. Then she adjusted her watch, noted the time, and walked out the front door without a single backward glance. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who needed you more than you needed them, this story is for you. Jane didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't explain herself. To someone who never deserved the explanation. She just moved, and every move was already 3 steps ahead. If you want to see exactly how a woman who was called replaceable becomes completely untouchable, subscribe, hit the bell, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Caleb is about to realize the servers are down. Don't just watch, stay, because the part where he tries to get it all back, that's where it gets devastating. She did not go back to the bedroom. There was nothing in that room she needed anymore. Everything worth keeping had already been removed. Quietly, methodically, over the course of 72 hours that Caleb had spent in back-to-back board meetings she had personally scheduled, so he would stay out of her way. She had moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of operating in environments where hesitation is the difference between extraction and exposure. No second guesses, no sentiment, just the clean forward motion of a decision already made at the cellular level. She returned to the study and sat down at the secondary terminal, hers, not his, though he had never once asked about the difference, and she opened the Meridian partition. The files were arranged the way she had arranged everything in her life, by priority, by consequence, by what could and could not be replaced. 3 years of classified architecture, logistics frameworks that Caleb had presented to Pentagon liaisons as his own design. Encryption protocols his development team had called visionary, because they had no idea his wife had written the core structure at 4 a.m. on the kitchen floor while he slept off a fundraising gala. She did not feel anger about this. She had stopped feeling anger about it sometime in the second year, when anger had proven itself an inefficient use of a resource she needed elsewhere. What she felt now was something quieter and more permanent, the specific clarity that comes when a commanding officer surveys a battlefield and formally classifies it as lost. She plugged in the encrypted drive, matte black, military grade, the kind that required biometric clearance in a passphrase Caleb had never thought to ask for. And she began the transfer. The progress bar moved without rushing her. She watched it the way she watched everything, without flinching, without looking away. When the transfer completed, she ejected the drive, turned it twice in her fingers, and pressed it into the interior pocket of her uniform jacket, directly over her sternum, where it would stay until she decided otherwise. Then, she opened a second window. The command was simple, 11 characters. She had written it weeks ago and saved it in a partition labeled with a date 6 months in the future, so that if Caleb's IT team ever ran an audit, which they wouldn't because she had trained them not to look too hard, it would read as a scheduled maintenance note rather than what it actually was, a decommission order. She entered the passphrase, let her thumb rest on the biometric pad for the 2 seconds it required. Then, she hit execute. Nothing happened yet. That was the point. The command was not a bomb. It was a slow and irreversible tide. It would begin pulling the foundational clearances from Caleb's government contracts over the next 48 hours, quietly, invisibly, the way a structure loses integrity long before the wall comes down. By the time anyone with his level of access thought to check, the credentials would already be vapor. The servers would already be speaking a language his team had never been cleared to learn. She marked the timestamp in her personal log. Then she closed the terminal, stood, and picked up her patrol cap from the desk where she had set it. She pressed it back into place with both hands and squared it the way she always did, 2 fingers above the brow, level, precise. She looked at the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved. The study was dark except for the ambient bleed of the city through the glass, that cold gold light that made everything in the penthouse look expensive and slightly unreal. She crossed to the mahogany desk, his desk, the one she had sourced from a broker in Seoul because he had wanted something that looked serious, something that would read well in the profile pieces, and she set the sealed folder in the center, both hands. She squared the edges until the alignment was exact, the way she squared everything, not from obsession, but from the deep wired understanding that precision is a form of respect. Even now, even for this. She removed the ring next. $600,000 of platinum and diamond that she had worn without complaint and without particular attachment, the way she wore everything Caleb had given her, as a garment appropriate to the environment, no more meaningful than the dress. Uniform she kept pressed and hanging in the back of the closet. She held it for a moment in her palm. Not from sentiment, just from the habit of assessing weight before setting something down permanently. She placed it on top of the folder. Then she reached into her cargo pocket and removed the second document, the one she had drafted herself, formatted in the precise language she had spent 12 years learning to write without emotion, the security access revocation. Clean, formal. Effective the moment it was signed, which it already was, which meant that somewhere in a federal system Caleb didn't know existed, her name was already removed from his clearance chain. He just didn't know it yet. She slid it beneath the ring, centered it, stepped back. She did not look at the desk again. She picked up the single bag from beside the door and walked down the hallway, past the abstract art she had chosen and he had taken credit for, past the kitchen where she had cooked the dinners. that made his investors feel at home, past the entry table with his keys and his curated collection of watches, and the small silver dish where she used to leave notes he stopped reading in the second year. She did not stop at any of it. There was nothing here that had ever truly been hers. You cannot leave behind what was never given. She opened the front door and walked out. The rain was immediate and indifferent, the kind that doesn't build. It simply arrives, fully committed, soaking through to the skin in the first 3 seconds. Jane stood at the base of the private drive, and she let it come. She did not reach for her hood. She did not shift her weight or turn her face away. She had stood in worse. She had stood in actual weather, in actual darkness, in places that didn't have names on maps Caleb had ever seen, and she had held her position until the mission was complete. This was just rain. She exhaled slowly through her nose and felt something she had not felt in a long time, not relief exactly, but the particular release of a soldier who has finally, after years of operating behind enemy lines, been given permission to come home. She heard them before she saw them. 4 black armored SUVs turned the corner in clean formation, headlights cutting through the dark without drama, the way professional things move, with certainty rather than urgency. They pulled to a stop along the drive in a precise line, engines idling at a register too low and too controlled to belong to anything civilian. The doors did not open immediately. There was a pause, 2, maybe 3 seconds, the kind of pause that belongs to people who have learned that a well-timed entrance communicates more than a fast one. Then the lead door opened. He stepped out into the rain, as though weather were a policy that applied to other people. Dark suit, no tie, the jacket cut with the particular precision of something made specifically for the body wearing it. Sharp jaw, dark hair, and eyes that held the particular quality she had recognized the first time she had ever sat across from him in a secured briefing room. Not the recognition of attraction, not the calculation of an adversary, but something rarer and more useful than either. The recognition of an equal. Eugene had never once looked at her the way Caleb looked at her. Caleb looked at her the way men look at infrastructure, with vague appreciation when it functions and irritation when it requires attention. Eugene looked at her the way a general looks at a map, with full attention, with respect for the terrain, with the understanding that what he was seeing was not decoration, but intelligence. He had not rushed her. In 2 years of proximity, 2 years of standing at the edges of rooms Caleb thought he was controlling, 2 years of watching her correct errors in silence and receive nothing in return, he had not once pushed, had not once leveraged the weight of what he knew, which was considerable, into pressure she hadn't asked for. He had simply waited, patient in the way of things that are very powerful and have no reason to be loud about it. He stood in the rain now, jacket absorbing the water without complaint, and he looked at her across the wet asphalt. One corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, something more deliberate than that. "It's about time, Commander." His voice was low and even, carrying the slight precise cadence of a man who learned English as a second language and had long since mastered it past the point of accent and into the territory of intention. Every syllable placed exactly where he meant it. Jane held his gaze for one moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the convoy. He fell into step beside her without touching her, without crowding her, without any of the performative courtesies men used when they wanted to signal ownership. He simply matched her pace, opened the rear door of the lead SUV, and waited while she got in. Then he came around to the other side and sat down next to her, and the convoy moved before anyone spoke another word. She was already gone before Caleb finished laughing. He found out from his mistress that Jane had left, or rather, the mistress saw the empty side of the closet and relayed it with a particular note of satisfaction that Caleb chose not to examine too closely. He stood in the master study for a moment, looked at the folder and the ring and the document beneath it, and he did not open the folder. He turned the ring over once between his fingers, set it back down, and exhaled through his nose with the specific sound of a man who has already decided not to be worried. "She'll be back," he said. He said it the way he said most things, with the rolling ease of someone who has never once been genuinely wrong about anything that mattered to him. 3 days, maybe 4. She has nowhere to go. She's a soldier. She doesn't know anything outside of this. The mistress did not push back. She had learned quickly that Caleb's certainty was not an invitation to dialogue. He left the folder on the desk. He went to bed at 10. He slept the way he always slept, completely without interruption, with the profound unconscious confidence of a man whose infrastructure has never once failed him. He did not know that his infrastructure had a name, and her name was Jane. The first error appeared at 6:14 on the second morning. A small thing. A credential timeout on the Meridian Gateway that his lead developer flagged as a server anomaly and attempted to refresh with a standard override. The override failed. He tried a secondary protocol. That failed too. He escalated to the system administrator, who attempted a root-level clearance reset and received, in return, a federal access denial code that none of them had ever seen before. Not because it was rare, but because it only appeared on systems that had been deliberately and irreversibly classified above their access tier. By 9 a.m., 3 of the 7 government contracts were returning authentication errors. By noon, the number was 5. By 3 p.m., the development team had stopped attempting overrides and started making phone calls, working their way up a chain of contacts who kept transferring them to departments with increasingly vague names and increasingly certain answers. This system has been placed under federal security review. No access will be restored without the authorization of the primary clearance holder. The primary clearance holder, Caleb's director of operations, called him out of a board meeting with the particular expression of a man delivering a diagnosis. He laid the situation out in clean, sequential order, the way professionals do when they need the person they're speaking to understand that this is not a problem that can be solved with money or confidence or a well-placed phone call. Caleb listened. He did not speak for a long time. Then he asked very quietly who the primary clearance holder was. His director looked at him with something that was almost sympathy and said the name. Caleb stood very still in the center of the boardroom. Through the glass behind him, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent and continuous. He thought about the ring he had left on the desk. He thought about the folder he still hadn't opened. He thought about what he had told his mistress 48 hours ago with the smooth, rolling certainty of a man who has never once considered that his comfort might be borrowed. She has nowhere to go. He thought about the 4 black SUVs on the security feed he'd just pulled, the ones that had arrived within 4 minutes of Jane walking out the front door. Military-grade vehicles that didn't appear in any registry his team had the clearance to search. He thought about the man who had stepped out of the lead car, the one Caleb had always assumed was a low-level hire, a security attachment Jane kept for professional appearances. He thought about the way that man had looked at her, not like a bodyguard looks at a principal, like a general looks at a commanding officer. Caleb opened the folder. He read the security revocation. He read the signature. He read the federal case number printed in the upper right corner, the number that, if he had known what he was looking at, would have told him this document had not been prepared last night in a moment of grief. It had been prepared weeks ago, filed, processed, quietly, permanently set into motion by a woman who had never once let him see her working. He sat down slowly in the boardroom chair. Outside, 62 floors below, the city continued without him. And somewhere beyond the reach of every contact he had, every favor he was owed, every system he believed he controlled, Jane was just getting started. The call came from the bank at 8:47 on the 3rd morning, and it came not from his personal banker, the one who used his first name and kept a bottle of the scotch he liked in the office drawer, but from a compliance officer whose voice carried the particular flatness of someone reading from a script they did not write and could not deviate from. All primary accounts associated with Caleb's personal and corporate holdings had been placed under a federal national security review. Effective immediately. No withdrawals, no transfers, no liquidations. All credit instruments tied to the flagged entities were suspended pending clearance authorization from the reviewing body, which could not be named, whose timeline could not be estimated, and whose decisions could not be appealed through any channel his attorneys had the clearance to access. Caleb asked what that meant in practical terms. The compliance officer told him with the careful neutrality of a person who had delivered this kind of news before and understood that the person receiving it would not believe it the first time, that it meant exactly what it sounded like. He tried his corporate card at the coffee cart in the lobby of his own building at 9:03 a.m. It declined. He tried a secondary card. It declined. He stood there in the lobby of the tower with his name on the lease, while the woman behind the cart looked at him with an expression she was working very hard to keep professional, and he understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to reach for something that had always been there and find nothing. His attorneys made calls. His attorney's attorneys made calls. By the end of the day, the consensus was unanimous and delivered with the grim precision of people billing by the hour for information no one wanted to hear. The review had been initiated through a federal channel that existed specifically to operate outside the reach of civil litigation. The assets would remain frozen until the reviewing authority determined otherwise. The reviewing authority answered to no one in any room Caleb had ever been invited into. He went home to the penthouse and sat in the study where the folder still lay open on the desk, and he looked at the ring in the center of it, and he thought about the name on the revocation document, and he thought about what that name connected to, and for the first time, he picked up the phone and called the one person he should have called 72 hours ago. His attorney answered on the second ring. "Who authorized a national security classification on Meridian?" Caleb asked. There was a pause, the kind of pause that costs money. "That's what we're trying to determine," the attorney said carefully. "What we know is that the classification was filed through a special operations clearance channel. That channel requires a minimum rank of—" "Commander," Caleb said. Another pause. "Yes," the attorney said. Caleb hung up. He hired the investigators on the fourth day, 3 of them, a firm out of D.C. that his business partner had used during a corporate espionage case 2 years prior, men who understood how to move through the edges of classified territory without technically crossing lines that would get them arrested. He gave them Jane's name, her rank, her last known associations, and the make and model of the vehicles from the security feed. He told them he needed to know where she was and what she was doing. They came back to him in 72 hours with a folder of their own. He opened it. The photographs were taken with long-range equipment, the kind that operated beyond the perimeter of whatever facility had been captured in the background. The facility itself was unmarked. No signage, no identifying architecture, nothing that would appear on a commercial map. But the investigators had cross-referenced the surrounding geography and determined it was a private R&D compound operating under a federal adjacent designation. Not military, not quite civilian. The kind of classification that existed in the productive gray space between the two, the kind that handled work that needed to get done without appearing in any budget committee's quarterly report. Jane was in 3 of the photographs. In the first, she was crossing a secured courtyard, still in uniform, moving with the same forward, zero-wasted motion stride that Caleb realized now he had always unconsciously read as military habit rather than what it actually was: authority. In the second, she was standing at the head of a briefing table visible through a window, 12 people seated in front of her, all of them in the particular posture of people receiving information they understood mattered. In the third, she was standing beside Eugene, not behind him, not near him, beside him, equal footing. His head was turned slightly toward her in the unmistakable body language of a man consulting someone whose judgment he trusts more than his own. Caleb set the photograph down. The investigators had included a note at the back of the folder, professionally worded, as all their communications were, but the message was clear enough. They had attempted to access background information on the man in the photographs through 4 separate research channels, and all 4 had returned either classified results or, in 2 cases, what appeared to be deliberate redirection, the digital equivalent of a door that doesn't just fail to open, but actively guides you away from the wall it's set into. They were returning his retainer. They did not have the clearance required to continue this particular inquiry, and they did not intend to acquire it. Caleb closed the folder. He thought about the way Eugene had stood at the head of those SUVs, the way his team had moved, the way not one of them had looked at Jane like she was being transported. They had looked at her like she was the destination. He thought about the Obsidian Gala. It was in 4 days, the most significant gathering of tech, defense, and private capital in the city, the kind of event where his face had always been expected, his presence assumed, his name on the program as a featured presenter. He still had his invitation. The review hadn't taken that. He made a decision that felt, in the moment, like reclaiming something. He would go. He would find her. And she would fix this. The Obsidian Gala occupied the top 3 floors of a building that was not publicly listed as an event venue, in a room that felt less like a ballroom and more like a war room that had learned how to wear black tie. The city spread out behind the glass walls in every direction, a living map of capital and consequence. The guests moved through it in the way of people who understood that the real conversations happened in the negative space between the official ones, in the pauses, in the walk from one cluster of power to another. Caleb arrived with 2 security personnel and the specific energy of a man performing a confidence he had spent 4 days losing ground on. He moved through the entrance with his name still on the list, his old name, his social name, the one attached to the version of himself that existed before the servers went dark. And he was admitted because no one at the door had been briefed to stop him, not yet. He saw Jane before she saw him. She was standing near the center of the room, and the difference between the woman he had last seen in a rain-soaked drive in a patrol cap and the woman in front of him now was not the dress, though the dress was significant. Deep charcoal, structured, the kind of garment that doesn't ornament a person so much as formalize them. The difference was the room. The room was oriented around her in the unconscious way of spaces that have recognized where authority actually lives. People did not approach her the way guests approach each other at events like this. They approached her the way officers approach a commanding officer, with purpose, with deference, with the implicit understanding that her time had value, and they were grateful for the portion of it being extended to them. Yu-Jin stood to her left. 3 men Caleb did not recognize stood at intervals around them, not crowding, not performing, simply present in the way of people who do not need to announce what they are. Caleb moved toward her with the momentum of a man who had decided that momentum was the only thing he had left. His 2 security personnel stopped walking before he did. He turned to look at them and found them standing very still, looking at the 3 men around Jane with a particular expression of professionals who have just performed a rapid and unfavorable comparison and arrived at a conclusion they were not paid enough to argue with. One of them met Caleb's eyes and gave him a look that communicated with admirable efficiency that they would wait for him near the bar. He kept walking, alone. The room did not part for him exactly, but it also did not make space for him the way it once had. The people he passed registered him the way people register a weather change, a brief flicker of attention, and then a return to more pressing concerns. 3 months ago, every conversation in this room would have paused for him. Tonight, the conversations continued. Jane turned when he was 6 feet away, as though she had always known he was there and had simply been choosing the correct moment to acknowledge it. Her eyes found him without searching. Her expression did not change in the way of someone surprised. It changed in the way of someone who has run the model, confirmed the output, and is now simply executing the final phase. "Caleb," she said, neutral, precise, the way she would have said it in a briefing room. "You need to stop this," he said. He kept his voice low and controlled, aware of the room in the way he had always been aware of audiences. "Whatever you've done, the accounts, the servers, the clearances, you need to reverse it. Tonight. I'll have my attorneys—" "Your attorneys," Yu-Jin said, "do not have the clearance to process the paperwork required to begin that conversation." Caleb looked at him. At the composed, particular stillness of a man who has not once in this interaction moved his hands or shifted his weight. A man who does not need to perform calm, because calm is not a performance for him. It is an environment. "This doesn't concern you," Caleb said. "I think," Yu-Jin said, with the measured patience of someone explaining something to a person who will not enjoy the explanation, "that it concerns me more than it concerns you." He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a single document. He held it out, not to Caleb, but to the room, the way you present evidence in a venue where the audience is the point. 14 months ago, he said, his voice carrying now, in the way of someone who has done the math on acoustics, your company's primary debt instrument was purchased through a private capital vehicle. That vehicle has been held in trust pending a specific set of conditions. The room had gone the particular quiet of people who are still holding their drinks but have stopped moving them. "Those conditions," Yu-Jin continued, "have been met." Caleb looked at the document. He did not reach for it. He had stopped being certain his hands would cooperate. "The debt on your company's primary credit line," Yu-Jin said, "is called, in full, tonight." The number he named was not large in the way of numbers that shock ordinary people. It was large in the way of numbers that reorganize the architecture of a room. Several of the guests nearest to them shifted their weight. Several others found reasons to step slightly closer. "That's not," Caleb started. "It is legal," Eugene said, simply. "I encourage you to verify it. You'll find the original instrument has your signature on page 4. Caleb knew, with the cold certainty of a man whose lawyers had explained the terms to him 18 months ago, in language he had not fully attended to because the deal had been good and the money had been immediate, that it was true. He looked at Jane. "You did this," he said, not an accusation, something closer to the moment of understanding that arrives too late to be useful. "You did this," she said, quiet, exact, the way she said everything. "I just kept the records." He became aware then of the 4 men who had moved into position around him, not his security, who were still near the bar, but 4 others, in the particular posture of people with federal designation and the documentation to act on it. One of them stepped forward and produced credentials that several people in the immediate vicinity recognized and responded to by taking a deliberate half-step back. The charge, when it was read, was not delivered loudly. It didn't need to be. The room was already silent. The attempted sale of classified military software, the Meridian framework, to a foreign commercial entity. The filing date on the federal charge was 3 weeks old. It had been building the entire time Caleb had been sitting in the penthouse, waiting for Jane to come back. He looked at her once more as they moved him toward the exit. He was searching her face for something: regret, satisfaction, grief, any of the emotional currencies he had always assumed she was holding. She had none of it. She was watching him with the same quiet, steady attention she had given the progress bar on the encrypted drive the night she left, the same clean focus of a woman who has completed a mission and is already assessing the terrain ahead. Then Eugene stepped to the center of the room and spoke, and the room turned toward him, the way rooms turn toward the person who has just demonstrated they control the gravitational center of it. He introduced the Meridian framework, its origins, its architecture, its 3 years of classified development, and he named the person who had built it. He introduced her not as a spouse, not as a former military officer. He introduced her as the founder of Meridian, and then, to the portion of the room that understood what that second title meant, the portion that moved in the same operational shadow that Eugene had always occupied, he introduced her as the new sovereign of the syndicate's Eastern Front. Jane stepped forward into the center of the room, and the room did not applaud in the conventional sense. What moved through it was something quieter and more substantial, the recognition of a room full of powerful people encountering, for the first time, someone with more power than any of them had correctly accounted for. She stood in the city light with her shoulders level and her chin exactly where it always was, and she looked like what she had always been, even in the years when only one other person in any room had been paying close enough attention to see it. The most dangerous person present. Caleb had called her a soldier, like it was a limitation, like it drew a border around what she was capable of and kept her inside it. He had looked at her uniform and seen a woman with nowhere to go. He had never once understood that the uniform was not the limit. It was the beginning. If you stayed this far, you already know this story isn't really about revenge. It's about what happens when someone who has been carrying everything in silence finally decides to put it down and pick up something else entirely. Jane's story is just getting started, and so is this channel. If you want to see what she builds next, what Eugene calls in, what Caleb tries one last time from a federal holding room, and what the Meridian framework was actually designed to do, subscribe. Hit bell. Because the next chapter is the one nobody saw coming, not even Jane.